So, this journeying through the prophetic series is really interesting because it is just, it's meant in so many ways to not only give the body of Christ essential information about who they are and who biblical prophets were, and how, in so many ways, we are living very much into, or should, or ought to live very much into um, uh, key aspects of these identities. But it is also meant to kind of give you hints and clues and to whet your appetite for summer classes that we're offering in May and June. Two of those classes in particular will treat prophets. So the first one is called Prophets and Prophecy, and it's a class that focuses on both Hebrew Bible and New Testament, and more so Hebrew Bible though. And we just discuss who prophets were, what prophecy is, and how the activity, how prophets act, what are key aspects of their messages, and then that leads. It's a 4-week course, and it leads into. You don't have to take the second part. A second course that starts at the end of June that talks about nurturing the prophetic imagination. So that's when we take it to more contemporary concerns, and we think through how any of that stuff relates to us. Um, this class is also meant in so many ways to give you an idea as to who we are as an institute, and to help you do something and not be bored while we're all stuck in our houses, looking at walls or binge watching all of our favorite shows on Netflix or Hulu. So we're here to grow as a community, to spiritually develop, and as a community, and to get to know who God is. And prayerfully, there are hints and clues as to who you are in this as well. This is an atmosphere full of sharing, and that is the goal. That is what it is meant to be. So, one of the things that's at work here, in this journey through the prophetic series is, we kind of start off with thinking through what a prophet is, and the types of prophets in the Hebrew Bible mostly. So, talking about occupational prophets or institutional prophets versus peripheral prophets. And then we shift over into our webinar on Thursday and talking about how prophets do their work. So, how the prophetic message is shared, how they intercede prophetically, and what that has to do with us in our own society in this very broken and chaotic world we're living in right now, actually. Beyond that, our classes on Jesus as prophet and human identity and Sabbath. Those are classes where we discuss the messages, key messages of certain prophets or prophetic voices. And then we conclude the journey through the prophetic webinar with a discussion on what prophecy or what the prophetic is not. And this is having gone through some webinars that kind of give you hints and clues as to what it is according to the Bible and how that relates to us. So today we're just going to talk about what prophets, who prophets were, how they, what role or office they assumed in society, and pretty much how that led into uh, various civic or political or religious responsibilities. Um, so we are going to work through this course that way. So, as a start, I want to ask you, what are prophets? How do they function? And there's really very few wrong answers. Like I always say, tell my students there are no wrong answers. I mean, in truth, there are, but there are very few. So don't be shy. Share. What are prophets? How do they function? What do they do? What do you think they do?
It's our, you hear me? Okay. Prophets are They really function as the mouthpiece of God. They function as the spokesmen who come to deliver judgment, folks that come to bring order, to bring restoration. They come with the plumb line to kind of set the standard.
Good. Yeah. Anything else? I mean, that's pretty much everything I would have said as well. I'm going to give you some examples and a little bit of the language. You use the word spokesman. That's exactly what the Hebrew and Greek translates to when we're thinking about the word in Hebrew that's predominantly used for the term prophet. There are many others. Nabi, it's one who prophesies, a spokesman, one who speaks essentially. And then prophetess in Greek, which you hear the Greek and you totally hear the word, but in hindsight, it's just a spokesman. And really, the Hebrew and Greek term for them, it's fairly neutral. You can have a prophetess in the political arena that has nothing to do with God or divinities. Um, and the same with the Hebrew, of course, when we're reading through the Bible, the term Nabi is generally used for a prophetic voice, and the person that is prophesying on behalf of a deity. So it's a lot more religious when we're talking about the Hebrew because of the context of the Hebrew Bible, but in the Greek, it's very, very neutral. Prophets are intermediaries, so they work, they live in and on boundaries. Um, and they do this work in a whole lot of ways. So, whenever I think of prophets as mediaries, one of the first people that I think about is Moses. Now, there are some texts in the Hebrew Bible that will tell you, oh, Moses is not a prophet. And then there are other texts that will tell you Moses is, because people have a very specific idea as to what comprises um, and what or how prophets function or receive their messages. But Moses, in so many ways, in our context, is extremely prophetic, and he is very much an intermediary. So in Exodus chapter 19, and if you have your Bibles, please join me there. The Israelites have reached Mount Sinai from their long trek from Egypt. And one of the first things that occur is the people are consecrated. But before they are consecrated, they have to receive this instruction to be consecrated, and what to do in preparation for that. And Moses is the person God uses for that. Moses' role as intermediary is really funny because in our context, oftentimes we think of God as omnipresent, as not needing a messenger, but Moses is messenger for God and messenger for the people. So whenever there's something God needs to say to the people, God tells Moses and Moses tells the people, and then when the people give Moses an answer for God, Moses has to take that message from the people to deliver it to God. And Exodus 19 is an example of that. It's really funny to me. Nonetheless, it's great. Um, let's start in verse 3. So it says, Then Moses went up to God, and by the way, I'm reading the NRSV um, translation of the Bible. Then Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the Israelites, You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured people out of all the peoples. Indeed, the earth is mine, the whole earth is mine. But you shall be for me a priestly people, a priestly kingdom, and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the Israelites. So Moses is getting word from God for the Israelites. This is what Moses does in verse 7. Moses came, he summoned the elders of the people and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded. And the people all answered as one, Everything that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Moses reported the words of the people to the Lord, and then the Lord said to Moses, I am going to come to you in a dense cloud in order that the people may hear when I speak with you and trust you thereafter. This these verses are brilliant. First off, you have Moses as standing as a boundary. He's standing as an intermediary in the boundary between God and the people. God communicates to Moses, Moses communicates to the people communicate to Moses, Moses communicates to God. And then it is in this reference that we find in verse 9 that what the Lord wants to do is make sure the people know who their intermediary is. It's Moses. So let me go ahead and spook the crap out of them so that they can trust you, Moses. That's essentially what God is doing. And that's what God is saying. And that's what God does in chapters 19 and 20. God appears to the people in a really heavy cloud, and there's thunder and lightning. There's a theophany happening, a God sighting. The mountain, there's language in the Hebrew that suggests that the mountain might have been uh, levitating and shaking, and the people are so afraid. And they hear God's voice, and the people are like, no, Moses, God can't talk to us anymore. You're it. It's you, right? But this all occurs through Moses as intermediary. Another example I want to mention is how prophets function as intermediaries. It's just Israel as a nation. And this is where we can find commonalities with us, especially in this time, in this international pandemic that we're in. Israel, the people, function as intermediaries. They function very much like prophets standing between or standing in a boundary between God and the nations. So in Zechariah chapter 8, verses 23, we find a great reference. You'll know or notice that I use a lot of Hebrew Bible. It's a term for the Old Testament. I love the Old Testament. Um, and it's full of so many really great examples and full of texts that people rarely ever read. So I have people read them in Amanah. Nonetheless, Zechariah chapter 8, and this is around verse 23. And just to give you a little bit of context, not much, Zechariah is a prophet in the early restoration period. He is prophesying during the Persian period. This is after the people have gone through a very rough time. They've spent quite a few decades in a foreign land after having their land utterly destroyed, people killed, and having been stolen and pretty much taken to a foreign place. And because their religion and identity was tied to that land that was destroyed and the temple that was destroyed in it, this early restoration period is a time where where the prophet's role is heavily tied to helping the people regain a sense of their identity because either they've forgotten or they're newbies. They're the generation who did not experience the exile. They're the children of the people who went through this hurtful time and they honestly just don't know. So, this is what Zechariah says about it. This is verse 23. He says, or the text says, thus says the Lord of hosts, in those days 10 men from nations of every language shall take hold of a Jew. By the way, Jew is right in this text. I always tell my students that there is very little Judaism in the Bible. There's early Israelite religion, but it's not Judaism until quite late, and this is one of those late texts where there is actually a Jew present. So the nations are going to take hold of a Jew. They're going to grasp his garment and say, "Let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you." Right? This text is amazing. Where do you have to be to grab at someone's skirt? You got to be really low, really humble. And the idea here is that the people rise as lights, the people in God's ability to restore the people, the nations will crawl and beg at the feet of the Israelites in order to get to know this God that they know. Isaiah 60 is quite similar. Also a post-exilic text, so an early restoration text, the end of Isaiah, not the beginning or middle. Isaiah is divided into three books, you guys. We might talk a little bit about that later. Nonetheless, this is something that the church today really needs to also really glean from and hold fast to. It's Isaiah 60, starting in verse 1. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples, but the Lord will rise upon you, and his glory will appear over you. Nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. Lift up your eyes and look around. They all gather. They come to you. Your sons shall come from afar away. Your daughters shall be carried on their nurses' arms. And then you shall see and be radiant. Your heart shall thrill and rejoice because the abundance of the sea shall be brought to you. The wealth of the nation shall come to you. So in this chapter, the people are not just experiencing light, they are the light. The people are intermediaries for the nations. The nations, the kings are meant to be attracted to this people, this restored Israel. Um, and not just the nations, the people of the nations and their kings, their leaders, but also their wealth as a result of it. So we find intermediaries all over the text, even with people who weren't quite identified as prophets. So as intermediaries, we find prophets operating as a ton of things. They operate as counselors, they operate as wise men, like Daniel, who is one of the Chaldeans. He's one of the wise men of Babylon. The king looks to him for dream interpretation and wisdom. The same with Joseph, who gets really close and really high up to the Pharaoh in Egypt in the book of Genesis, all on account of existing between boundaries or borders and being able to offer counsel as a result of it. Um, Prophets act as intercessors like Moses and Abraham. When Abraham is walking in Genesis, there's an example in verse 7 where in his experiences, he gets himself in a hot pickle, by lying about his sister or semi-lying about his sister slash wife. Um, but in that text, when the king suffers, God tells the king, hey, go to Abraham. He's going to intercede for you, make things right. He'll make you better. And in that text, Genesis 27, Abraham is specifically identified as a prophet who has this ability to intercede for this foreign king. And they are expounders of the law. Deborah in the book of Judges is a female prophetess. She's also a judge, and she is one of the very few judges of the book of Judges who is a woman. She's the only one. And B, one of the few judges who's actually known for interpreting the law. There's a great image of her in the Lego Testament. There's a Bible online that you can see for free that depicts stories in the Bible as Lego pieces. And her piece shows her as represented in the Hebrew Bible as sitting under a tree, teaching the people the law and resolving their civil concerns. So she's very much like a Moses-like figure. Okay, questions? Comments? Thoughts? Okay, cool. Well, if prophets are working in these very um, boundary-like ways, and this is permitting them to work as counselors and wise men and intercessors, should have put wise women next to the men, and expounders of the law, um, where do you think they might work?
Yeah, that's interesting. I was gonna ask a question. So then pretty much at this stage in time, because I know that there are they're priests also, right? So like what then how would prophets be um defined differently from priests? Like if being a prophet encompasses so much, especially like as intermediaries, like um back then were these folks primarily just working in these different fields, or they had these different stuff that they did, and being a prophet was just kind of like a gifting for them, or were they actually recognized as prophets? Does that make sense? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question. Some prophets are priests, but not all prophets are priests, and not all priests are prophets. They're not one and the same. So, um, for example, Ezekiel is taken off into exile in the first deportation in 591, and he is living in Babylon. He is from a priestly family, and the year in which he's supposed to serve in the temple is essentially his year that God calls him to be a prophet. He's not working as a priest in the book of Ezekiel. He's just a prophet. And he's actually a peripheral prophet. He's not tied to any type of institution or there's no reference in the text to him being tied to any type of institution. And he just kind of does his work in front of the people. He can't talk. He's stricken as mute for quite a bit of the text. Eventually, he does get a voice back, but he's prophesying with his body. We'll get more into that on Thursday, and doing all this crazy stuff, but he's not doing it as a priest. He's doing it as a prophet. And the only way that we're able to affirm or see his priestliness in the text is actually through his messages. It's like the priest in him won't go away. He envisions a temple, and when he envisions this restored temple actually
Can,
so this restored temple is actually pretty heavily priestly. Like the numbers he uses, um uh the way that he builds it and sets it up, and who can enter and who can't. Also, Ezekiel is meant to cook his food over human dung, like feces, and God is like, Ezekiel's like, I can't do that, God. That's gonna make me defiled. And God is like, okay, use cow dung. So it's in those little small examples that we actually see Ezekiel's priestly nature come out, but he's not a priest. He's a he's a prophet. Amos is a peripheral prophet who's not tied to priesthood at all. And then there are prophets who are tied, or priests who are tied to who are prophets, and vice versa. Eli, for example, has prophetic activity going on, right? God communicates with Eli, or at least God used to communicate with Eli. There seems to be like a word drought in the time, which is when Samuel is chosen. But Eli, his official office was as priest. So they're not one and the same. Priests have their occupation requires that they serve in the temple, that they intercede for the people through the sacrificial system, because while prayer is happening, prayer is the sacrificial system. It doesn't actually become something that is hugely important and emphasized in the text as things that people do together and regularly until there's no more temple and you can no longer offer sacrifices. So priests kind of offer sacrifices on behalf of the people. Sometimes they communicate on behalf of God for the people. But they're doing this often from, just their role as priest and not necessarily their role as prophet. Sometimes they don't have a prophetic role at all. I hope that makes sense and answers your question.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
Can you go back to the last slide?
Sure.
So, do you want to answer?
Yeah, what you mean? You said what?
Had a bit of an echo there.
Oh, hold on. Is that better?
No.
Here, go over there. Hold on.
You said work live in on boundaries. What are the boundaries?
You said the slide where it says intermediate prophets work, live in, and on boundaries. So I think
What boundaries? What are the boundaries?
That's an excellent question. And I should have mentioned this. It's the boundary between the divine and the not so divine. It's often the boundary between the sacred and the profane, right? Um, Moses is human, but he's some kind of human who has this ability or this grace to experience the divine in ways that no one else can. And because of this, he kind of operates as this kind of divine human, if I can say that, right? Um, that will be the boundary in religious sense. In a religious sense, in a political sense, if you had a prophetess or a herald, in a political sense, it would be between the elite and then the people. But the the boundary in this case is one between the divine and the not so divine.
I have a question
Yeah.
with regards to you said who are prophets like now, and it has expounders of the law. And um, I think, at least for myself, I've confined prophets to like people in the church, pastors, just different people in the church. Um, have never met a prophet outside of the church because my mind was so narrowed and focusing on you can only be a prophet if somebody ordains you that way, if you've been given that title, um, if somebody in a church said that that's what you were. Um, so who would we identify now as expounders of the law? Those would be like political people. And of course, the way things are now, nobody's trusting them to be a prophet. Like, you know what I mean? So who would you identify as?
So I think you.
Huh?
Yeah, it's a good question. So when we're talking about expounders of the law in the Bible, we're talking about people who are explaining God's law, right? Because the law in ancient Israelite society is religious, it's political too, but it's very much religious. And the Bible is interested in Torah. Doesn't tell us much about the laws, the political laws of the land. Now, if we had to think about this, yeah, prophets definitely exist in the church, but they definitely exist outside of the church. And many of our politicians, our scientists, our medical doctors, our teachers, you can think of any and every profession, there are prophets in those fields. Um, and we don't necessarily call them prophets, and they might not be expounding upon God's law or the Bible, but there is something that they are explaining or providing light um, or information regarding. And so, yeah, a politician can certainly be a prophet in so many ways. We are all prophets. It's all of us. But you just got to know your sphere of influence, who you're meant to impact, who you're meant to, where you're meant to do your prophetic activity. Some people just do their prophetic activities in the comforts of their own home. Parents are prophets to their children, right? Like, but they might not prophesy much outside of their home, but they're very much acting as prophets in the lives of their children. They're also pastors in the lives of their children, right? So there's a prophet in all of us. But yeah, there are political leaders who are prophets. I've been trying to stay away from politics because our country's political system is a little jacked up right now. So I can't give you any names of people that I think, or examples of people who've been quite prophetic, but in the political arena. But I can give you examples of scientists and medical practitioners who've been quite prophetic, or even people in the technological arena who've been forced to think about how technology touches every aspect of our world, including the health and medical field, and who prophesied a pandemic like the one that we're facing now and our inability to control the spread of it. So, so yeah, I hope that kind of answers your question. Awesome. So we talked a little bit about peripheral prophets, and I've just given you some examples. Peripheral prophets are people whose prophetic activity has nothing to do with the institution, or very little to do with the institution. And in this case, you find people like Amos, and Amos chapter 7 is a great example of peripheral prophets. Because Amos chapter 7, by the way, Amos is a prophet in the southern kingdom of Judah, and he has to do his prophetic work in the northern kingdom of Israel. This is when the kingdoms were divided in the 8th century BCE, so real long time ago. And yeah, Amos has to leave his land to do his prophetic work. And he's stepping on the toes of institutional prophets while it happens. And Amos chapter 7 is a great example of that. So you find two prophets, Amos, who's peripheral, and Amaziah, who most likely was a court prophet. So chapter 7, verses 10, starting in verse 10.
Can you give the definition for peripheral prophet one more time?
Yeah, so peripheral, something outside, right? So it's or something adjacent. So peripheral prophets are prophets who do their activities outside or with very little to no connection to an institution. So I don't even want to bring that up. I won't bring that up because that was going to be a real dicey example of modern day church. But
Just bring it
there's a
up.
lot of So my thought was a lot of people discuss people who are not ordained to the prophetic office, or people who are prophets in actuality but don't have coverings. They call them sometimes vagabond prophets, or these really bad negative words that don't quite make much sense in my opinion. Or renegade prophets, I've heard that. Peripheral prophets in the ancient world probably would have very much looked like our definition or how we see renegade prophets today. They're people who seemingly don't have much of a covering. They're just doing it because they're called to, essentially. Um, they're not tied to any person of power.
Excuse me. What does character has to do with prophets?
Character.
See, all right. Just I'll leave it right there. I'll leave it right there for now.
Oh, that's a loaded question. Um, Character it has a lot to do with the realm of the prophetic, but it's gonna push us off today's topic. But we are discussing that in the Sabbath in Jesus's prophet and in the Sabbath in human identity webinars, because character has a lot to do with, and also the things the prophetic is not. Because the character of these prophets for the most part is actually rooted in their messages. And we're going to more so talk about the messages of the prophet after we talk about who they are, which is this lecture, and how they do what they do, which is the prophetic intercession webinar. I hope it's okay that I table your question, but I'm going to write it down. One moment.
Oh yeah, that's fine. She heard me.
Mm-hmm.
She paused.
But it's a good question. It's a really good question. I wish more people asked that question, to be honest. Nonetheless, Amos chapter 7, verse 7. This is really good to understand peripheral prophets. This is what he showed me. The Lord was standing beside a wall. Wait, hold on. That's not what I want to read. It's verse 10. Chapter 7, verse 10. Yes, here we are. Then Amaziah, the priest of Bethel. This is a priest. So a priest who might have been more like a prophet because he seems to have an issue with what Amos is doing, sent to King Jeroboam of Israel, or had some kind of prophetic activity going on, saying, Amos hath conspired against you in the very center of the house of Israel. The land is not able to bear all his words. For thus Amos has said, Jeroboam shall die by the sword, and Israel must go into exile away from the land. And Amaziah said to Amos, O seer, this term seer is the word kozeh. It is a person, is a stargazer, a person who is seeing things, has visions, and in so many ways, it's a term that we use to reference people who have prophetic activity that is manifesting in and through seeing, and that's what's happening with Amos. He also hears, though, it's clear in the text. Go flee away to the land of Judah, earn your bread there, and prophesy there, but never again prophesy at Bethel, for it is the king's sanctuary, and it is a temple of the kingdom. When Amaziah is saying to Amos, go earn your bread there, he's saying go earn your money there in your own land, in the land of Judah where you're from. He's referencing occupational prophets. The idea is Amos is not from the northern kingdom. Why are you here? Is what Amaziah is saying. And Amaziah is saying, go do that somewhere else, right? Go do that in the court of your own kingdom. That's where you should get your money. This is what Amos says in verse 14. I am no prophet, nor a prophet's son. Oh, that's so good for institutional or companies of prophets and schools of prophets. But I am a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore trees, and the Lord took me from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, go prophesy to my people. Right? Amos is saying, I'm not a prophet by occupation. I am only by occupation. This is how I make my money. I dress sycamore trees, and I'm a shepherd. That's what I do. I wasn't called, or I'm not paid to do this. God just simply called me, told me to go do these things and say these words, and that's what I'm doing. And then he pronounces a prophetic curse, or he gives a negative prophetic word to Amaziah. Nonetheless, Amos is a great example of a peripheral prophet, someone who is not institutional. He does not make his bread there. He doesn't earn his food there. The prophecy does not take care of him. Institutional prophets in this case are, and occupational prophets by extension, they're people who are cared for as a result of their office as a prophet. So court prophets, they work in the court of the king. They counsel the king. Isaiah, for one, in Isaiah 38, he is seen to be doing some activity with King Hezekiah. Hezekiah has a question, or Hezekiah is sick and he doesn't want to die in one of these examples. And he requests that Amos, or excuse me, Isaiah, son of Amos, not Amos, Amos, comes and intercedes for him. And Isaiah does. In the other reference, Isaiah is summoned to counsel the king on a political matter. Another example of a court prophet is in 1 Kings chapter 22. It's with a guy named Micaiah. Micaiah in Hebrew, me who? Me? It means who. That's how I remember it. Who is like God? Yah, God, right? This guy, and it's a great reference because in 1 Kings chapter 22, the king Jehoshaphat and Ahaz are gathered together, and they're thinking through whether they should go to war. And Jehoshaphat says, go find a prophet." Go find you some prophets. Bring them here. So they ask these 400 prophets, court prophets, right? Should we go? They say yeah, right? And Jehoshaphat is like, I'm not pleased with that answer. Go find me a good one, like another prophet. And they call Micaiah, who is known for never giving the king good prophetic words or words that are in his favor. And Micaiah is the one who pronounces or who actually gives the word of the Lord. And this is where we find the lying spirit being evident in the text. Nonetheless, Micaiah is acting as a court prophet in that way. Then there are cult prophets. Cult prophets, what we mean by cult is not our thought for cult. It's not this outside movement of people that's a little sketchy. It's just religious group, right? The ancient Israelite religion can be viewed as a cult of Israel. We're talking about their religious center. Um, so cult prophets, they are prophets that work and earn their money working tied to the temple, if that makes any sense. In 1 Kings chapter 18, 20 through 40, great chapter. This is where we find Jezebel, aka Jezi, and her 400 prophets of Baal and 450 prophets of, or 450 of Baal and 400 of Asherah. They are cult prophets. And they might have had a role with the court as well because Jezebel is queen. But yeah. So you find these all over the place. Questions about the types of prophets that we find here in the text? I hope all of this makes a lot of sense, and I hope you're learning something.
Prophets work mostly outside the church, and institutional mostly work inside the flipped.
And it doesn't have to be a church. It can be a court, the court of the king.
Yeah, that's fine.
It can be other political centers or civic centers. Peripheral prophets, they're not tied to any institution at all. That seems to be the idea, and it doesn't mean that they never prophesy to the court, right? Or to the political center of the land. It just means they're not tied to it. It's not how they make their money. It's not their occupation. It's just it's like their, I don't want to say it's their side hustle because then that suggests they're making money, but it's their volunteer service to God. You can think of it that way. And people might, as a result of receiving counsel, give them money, right? And care for them. This might have happened, right? You don't come to a prophet empty-handed. Saul does not go to Elijah empty-handed, right? When he needs help finding his lost donkeys. But they don't necessarily primarily make any type of living that way. I hope that makes sense. The last thing I want to talk about are like prophetic schools and companies. So these institutional or occupational prophets, they are wild. Like when you realize this is an enterprise in the Hebrew Bible or also in the New Testament, but you find a lot more of it in the Old Testament, which is why I'm primarily treating that. Things are just crazy, you know. You start having all types of thoughts. So one thing that seems to be clear is that these institutional prophets were provided for by an institution. Either it was their temple, like the priests were provided for by temple offerings and things of that nature, or it was the political center. It was the state giving them or caring for them as a result of their prophetic activity. But there were also training programs. So lots of people know that there are prophetic teachers and apprentices like Elijah who trains Elisha, right? But a lot of people don't actually think about what's happening in the Bible as having any bit of legitimate training. There is a prophetic school, for example, that seems to be active in the book of Isaiah. And we can tell this because the book of Isaiah is no one book talking about one time and one particular people. It's actually split up into 3 different books that we call, as scholars, first Isaiah, second or Deutero Isaiah, or third or trito Isaiah, and they all are very different books written at different times by different hands. And the reason why we know this is because they're talking about different times. In the text in itself, the context is different. First Isaiah, which ends around um, in after chapter or in chapter 39, so it's chapters 1 to 39, primarily discusses um, the Assyrian, like what's happening when the Assyrians take over. So we're talking about the destruction of the northern kingdom. Isaiah, who the book is named after, he's the person referenced in First Isaiah, and he's an 8th century prophet. So he's prophesying at the same time as Amos. They might have known each other, maybe not. Who knows? Um, but yeah, he is clearly discussing a time period where the northern kingdom is about to collapse. Now, similar language as to how he directs God, Holy One of Israel, themes that come up in the text, it comes up again 200 years later when we find the context of Deutero Isaiah, which starts in chapter 40 and ends in chapter 54. Um, we find the same language, the same theme, but the text was written 200 years later. And then in 3rd Isaiah, or Trito Isaiah, we're talking about the Persian period, which is later than Deutero Isaiah. And the themes, there's similar themes, similar language. It's still written in the name of or referencing this Isaiah figure, but it's a lot more inclusive. It's clear that this is after the exile, after the Babylonians have gone ahead and destroyed Jerusalem and the walls of Judah, um, or the walls around the city. So you have first Isaiah, Assyrian, uh, taking the destruction of northern kingdom, second Isaiah, Babylon, destruction of the southern kingdom, and then third Isaiah, the restoration period. 3 different periods, but same language or similar language, all written in so many ways under the name of this person named Isaiah, who could not have written it, not written it all. Um, so yeah, there's a prophetic school at work, a group of people or disciples that are trained in the theology, I guess you can say, or the worldview of Isaiah, and they continue this work of presenting that worldview for 3 very, very different um, social and political contexts. And then we find prophetic companies. Every time in 2 Kings 2, when Elisha is traveling with Elijah, and this is when Elijah is about to go up to heaven, every time he goes to a new city, it is a person from the company of prophets that say, hey, your master is going to leave you, right? There were groups of people who would gather together and learn together and prophesy together and travel together and care for one another. And this seems to be really evident throughout the Hebrew Bible. In 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 24, for example, Saul is searching after David. He wants him dead. But all of a sudden, the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Saul. And what does he do? He prophesies naked. And then what do the people say? Man, is Saul a part of, is he one of the prophets? Because it seems to have been a phenomenon in so many ways that these prophetic companies would go out and prophesy, have these ecstatic experiences. Last thing I want to say before I open this up to discussion is this is dangerous work. The moment you say something that the king doesn't like, if you're an institutional prophet, you can die, right? So while there are people training to be a prophet, while there are people getting paid to do this, it's a really dangerous job. They are constantly working on eggshells. Okay? So I feel like in some ways we've discussed some of these questions. um, throughout. There's been some reference to contemporary prophets and here, but I just want to know your thoughts about this before we conclude the class, and about how we might think about contemporary prophetic schools or contemporary occupational prophets today.
Can you repeat your question? I see the questions on the screen, and I know you said that we talked about some of them, but can you repeat what you just said?
Yeah, I just want to know what your thoughts are about how occupational prophets show up today, or how prophetic schools and companies show up and manifest today in our world.
Are there contemporary? I'm sorry, I know this is probably elementary, but what do you mean contemporary?
I mean, like right now, like in
Oh,
society today.
like right now?
Hmm.
You said, are there contemporary actual prophets? Um, is this necessary? Is this problematic? I think that there are. Um, I think in some ways it is necessary. But what's a little not confusing, but is that there is a prophet in all of us. So everybody has something different to say, and that's what makes it, you know, a little confusing. Is it necessary? I think it's. I think in some ways it could be necessary, especially if you have a group of people that don't understand the prophetic and don't have a connection with the voice of the Lord in those instances. I think it could be problematic because, um, you know, there's so many different agendas nowadays, and so that's my little 2 cents.
Yeah,
I
the
agree with
agenda.
you.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I agree with you on that because we have it's profit in all of us. So it's based on accountability. So when we speak or we teach on certain things, it should be some type of accountability for what we say. And and a lot of people is not aware that when we say certain things or we're teaching certain things, that we're speaking into the lives of people. And if we're not led by God, or if it's like in a professional type of teaching, we have to know what we say that is truthful and that we know it, because we are feeding that into another person's lives. So I also look at for it's like the occupational prophets. I see nowadays that's what is being more driven by those that's not really called by God. It's just something that they doing because they see something in a financial type of thing, and it goes back again. It should be some type of accountability for what these people is saying and speaking into these people's lives, because there's so many people out there that they want to hear the word. They want to hear something to direct them to change and different things like that. And we have a lot of people just out there just for the money and just saying all sorts of things, and they misguiding these people. So accountability today, we need more accountabilities with the occupational ones that's getting paid for money and traveling around and not being totally called and not listening to God, not really speaking what God's word is, because that's what the people is coming for. They want to hear a word from God, and people is just speaking certain things in them. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I heard a few things in this. Miss Felicia acknowledged that agenda is important. Like, what's your agenda? And this is one of the things that can make it problematic. And um, uh, and both Miss Johnson and Miss Felicia acknowledge that there is a prophet in all of us, and there's a need for accountability. Um, in particular, Miss Johnson mentioned traveling ministers, right? People who are making money off of some kind of prophetic or ministerial enterprise, and the need for accountability for them. This is certainly one of the ways that occupational prophets, or how we can see occupational prophets at work in our society. It's a really explicit one, though. These traveling prophets. But in addition to seeing traveling prophets, I want you to also think about who you might be and what occupation you might actually feel more of a leaning towards. You know, people are who are operating in the counseling field, or they're psychologists, or um, coaches, and oftentimes, you know, they prophesy without there even being any bit of wording or anything that suggests that they're prophesying, right? They're just kind of speaking into the lives of their patients, or their students, or their mentees, and helping them grow into who they are. That is a key aspect of the prophetic office. And in one way or another, we're all called to do that. What parents do in their own homes, they're doing that work, right? What pastors are doing in their churches, they should be doing that work. Now, does it mean it's quite their occupation? Well, that's a heftier question. I mean, parents technically don't get paid to do this very much needed work in the lives of their children. But, you know, being a mother, and therefore operating prophetically in the lives of their children, it's a hat, it's a role that um, they have, and that they live into, or should live into. So, yeah, we're out of time. So I want to thank you for coming, and just go ahead and invite you to our future webinars. As mentioned, we're going to continue this conversation on Thursday, but we're going to talk more about how prophets do their activity. So we're going to talk about prophetic intercession, and we're not just talking about prayer. We're talking about how people intercede, stand in the gap, act as liminal beings in the world through their bodies, through music, through dance, through demeanor. So we're gonna really expand this. We're not just gonna talk about prayer here, and we're not just gonna talk about people who are identified as prophets. We're gonna talk about people who are living into some kind of prophetic activity on account of or some kind of living in some kind of prophetic office on account of their activity. Um, then on the next Saturday, 1 week from today, we're going to have a Bible Hacks series. We're going to start our Bible Hack series, and we're going to focus on Bible language tools. We're really talking about using free online tools to do word studies and to help deepen your biblical study. And then we're going to come back a week from this Thursday, talk about Sabbath and human identity. Technically, it's Bible hacks, but it's also journeying through the prophetic in so many ways, because it's very much linked to the office and the message of the prophet. And we'll continue off at the end of the month with Jesus as prophet, and then 5 things the prophetic is certainly not. We'll have more webinars available to you for May, mid-April. So join us. They are free. All of them can be registered for through the link that you registered today with. And we're offering summer classes starting in May. So take them, join them. The summer session A that starts in May has 8-week courses. Session B, also starting in May, is 4-week courses. And then session C, starting in June, are also 4-week courses. And there's a webinar, or there will be a webinar that will kind of give you an idea of what all of these courses are about. So take advantage of them. You guys will receive a discount code in your email today, and you can register for these courses at Amanah Bible Institute.net. And registration occurs in a variety of ways. You can either register for our monthly subscription program, which allows you to take 1 to 3 courses for a set monthly fee, or you can register for the classes individually. Um, in the email, I will provide a link to our store and a link to our uh, April newsletter that will kind of give you an idea as to our payment methods and all the courses that we're offering. So if there are no more questions, we can conclude. If you do have questions, feel free to stay on and ask them. And they can be questions about anything, you know. But I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now. Thank you so much for coming, and I hope to see you in our next webinars.
Toya.